Hello? Hang on just one second. I'm looking at. Oh, sorry. I am going to be reading from The Great Gatsby. Reading from page 33 to page like 37. I'm tired, so I'm not going to read 5 pages. Yeah, that's all I'm going to do. Stop right there. So to give, we're in chapter 2. We have just gone through the Valley of Ashes. Nick Carraway and Tom Buchanan and Tom's woman, Myrtle Wilson. We met Myrtle and the other Wilson. What is it? I can't even remember what his first name is. Poor pathetic man who runs a gas station in the Valley of Ashes. Myrtle is Tom's mistress. Mr. Wilson has no idea what's going on. He knows something might be happening, but he certainly doesn't know that Tom is the philanderer. They have taken the train into New York City proper and are hanging out, are just arriving actually at Myrtle Wilson and Tom Buchanan's little love nest. So that's where that's coming from. All right. So Myrtle starts. I'm going to have the McKees come up, she announced as we rose in the elevator. And of course, I've got to call up my sister, too. The apartment was on the top floor. A small living room, a small dining room, a small bedroom, and a bath. The living room was crowded to the doors with a set of tapestried furniture entirely too large for it, so that to move about was to stumble continually over the scenes of ladies swinging in the gardens of Versailles. The only picture was an over-enlarged photograph, apparently of a hen sitting on a blurred rock. Looked at from a distance, however, the hen resolved itself into a bonnet, and the countenance of a stout old lady beamed down into the room. Several old copies of Town Tattle lay on the table together with a copy of Simon Called Peter, and some of the small scandal magazines of Broadway. Mrs. Wilson was first concerned with the dog. A reluctant elevator boy went for a box full of straw and some milk, to which he added, on his own initiative, a tin of large, hard dog biscuits, one of which decomposed apathetically in the saucer of milk all afternoon. Meanwhile, Tom brought out a bottle of whiskey from a locked bureau door. I have been drunk just twice in my life, and the second time was that afternoon. So everything that happened has a dim, hazy cast over it, although until 8 o'clock the apartment was full of cheerful sun. Sitting on Tom's lap, Mrs. Wilson called up several people on the telephone. Then there were no cigarettes, and I went out to buy some at the drugstore on the corner. When I came back, they had disappeared. So I sat down discreetly in the living room and read a chapter of Simon Called Peter. Either it was terrible stuff or the whiskey distorted things, because it didn't make any sense to me. Just as Tom and Myrtle, after the first drink Mrs. Wilson and I called each other by our first names, reappeared, company commenced to arrive at the apartment door. The sister, Catherine, was a slender, worldly girl of about 30, with a solid sticky bob of red hair and a complexion powdered milky white. Her eyebrows had been plucked and then drawn on again at a more rakish angle, but the efforts of nature toward the restoration of the old alignment gave a blurred air to her face. When she moved about, there was an incessant clicking as innumerable pottery bracelets jingled up and down upon her arms. She came in with such a proprietary haste and looked around so possessively at the furniture that I wondered if she lived there. But when I asked her, she laughed immoderately, repeated my question aloud, and told me she lived with a girlfriend in a hotel. Mr. McKee was a pale, feminine man from the flat below. He had just shaved, for there was a white spot of lather on his cheekbone, and he was most respectful in his greeting to everyone in the room. He informed me that he was in the artistic game, and I gathered later that he was a photographer and had made the dim enlargement of Mrs. Wilson's mother, which hovered like an ectoplasm on the wall. His wife was a shrill, languid, handsome, and horrible. She told me with pride that her husband had photographed her 127 times since they had been married. Mr. Wilson had changed her, Mrs. Wilson had changed her costume some time before and was now attired in an elaborate afternoon dress of cream-colored chiffon, which gave out a continual rustle as she swept about the room. With the influence of the dress, her personality had also undergone a change. The intense vitality which had been so remarkable in the garage was converted into an impressive hauteur. Her laughter, her gestures, her assertions became more violently affected moment by moment, and as she expanded, the room grew smaller around her until she seemed to be revolving on a noisy, creaking pivot through the smoky air. "My dear," she told her sister in a high, mincing shout, "most of the fellas will cheat you every time. All they think about is money. I had a woman up here last week to look at my feet, and when she gave me the bill, you thought she had my appendicitis out." "What was the name of the woman?" asked Mrs. McKee. "Mrs. Eberhart. She goes around looking at people's feet in their homes." "I like your dress," remarked Mrs. McKee. "I think it's adorable." Mrs. Wilson rejected the compliment by raising her eyebrows in disdain. "It's just a crazy old thing," she said. "I slip it on when I don't care what I look like." "But it looks wonderful on you, if you know what I mean," pursued Mrs. McKee. "If Chester could only get you in that pose, I think he could make something of it." We all looked in silence at Mrs. Wilson, who removed a strand of hair from over her eyes and looked back at us with a brilliant smile. Mr. McKee regarded her intently, with his head on one side, and then moved his hand back and forth slowly in front of her face. "I should change the light," he said after a moment. "I'd like to bring out some of the modeling of the features, and I try to get hold of all that back hair." "I wouldn't think of changing the light," cried Mrs. McKee. "I think it's—" Her husband said, "Shh." We all looked at the subject again, whereupon Tom Buchanan yawned audibly and got to his feet. "You McKees have something to drink," he said. "Get some more ice and mineral water, Myrtle, before everybody goes to sleep." "I told that boy about the ice." Myrtle raised her eyebrows in despair at the shiftlessness of the lower orders. "These people, you've got to keep after them all the time." She looked at me and laughed pointlessly. And she flounced over to the dog, kissed it with ecstasy, and swept into the kitchen, implying that a dozen chefs awaited her orders there. "I've done some nice things out in Long Island," asserted Mr. McKee. Tom looked at him blankly. "Two of them we have framed downstairs." "Two of what?" "Two studies. One of them I call Montauk Point, the Gulls, and the other I call Montauk Point, the Sea." Sister Catherine sat down beside me on the couch. "Do you live down in Long Island, too?" she inquired. "I live at West End." "Really? I was down there at a party about a month ago, and a man named Gatsby. Do you know him?" "I live next door to him." "Well, they say he's a nephew or cousin of Kaiser Wilhelm. That's where he gets all his money from." "Really?" She nodded. "I'm scared of him. I'd hate to have him get anything on me." This absorbing information about my neighbor was interrupted by Mrs. McKee pointing suddenly at Catherine. "Chester, I think you should do something with her," she broke out, but Mr. McKee only nodded in a bored way and turned his attention to Tom. "I'd like to do more work on Long Island if I could get the entry. All I ask is that she should give me a start." "Ask Myrtle," said Tom, breaking into a short spout of laughter as Mrs. Wilson entered with a tray. "She'll give you a letter of introduction, won't you, Myrtle?" "Do what?" she asked, startled. "You'll give Mr. McKee a letter of introduction to your husband so he can do some studies of him." His lip moved silently for a moment as he invented George B. Wilson at the gasoline pump, or something like that. Catherine leaned close to me and whispered in my ear, "Neither of them can stand the person they're married to." "Can't they?" "Can't stand them." She looked at Myrtle and then at Tom. "What I say is, why go on living with them if they can't stand them? If I was them, I'd get a divorce and marry to each other right away." She doesn't like Wilson either? The answer to this was unexpected. It came from Myrtle, who had overheard the question, and it was violent and obscene. "You see?" cried Catherine triumphantly. She lowered her voice again. "It's really his wife that's keeping them apart. She's a Catholic, and they don't believe in divorce." Daisy was not a Catholic, and I was a little shocked at the elaborateness of the lie. "When they do get married," continued Catherine, "they're going to live west for a little while until it blows over. I'd be more discreet to go to Europe." "Oh, do you like Europe?" she exclaimed surprisingly. "I just got back from Monte Carlo." "Really?" "Just last year I went over there with another girl." "You stay long?" "No, we went to Monte Carlo and back. We went by way of Marseille. We had over $1,200 when we started, but we got gypped out of it, all of it, in 2 days in private rooms. We had an awful time getting back, I can tell you. God, how I hated that town." The late afternoon sky bloomed in the window for a moment like the blue honey of the Mediterranean. Then the shrill voice of Mrs. McKee called me back into the room. "I almost made a mistake, too," she declared vigorously. "I almost married a little kike who'd been after me for years. I knew how he was below me. Everybody kept saying to me, 'Lucille, that man's way below you.' But if I hadn't met Chester, he certainly got me for sure." "Yes, but listen," said Myrtle Wilson, nodding her head up and down again. "At least you didn't marry him." "I know I didn't." "Well, I married him," said Myrtle ambiguously. "And that's the difference between your case and mine." "Why did you, Myrtle?" demanded Catherine. "Nobody forced you to." Myrtle considered. "I married him because I thought he was a gentleman," she said finally. "I thought he knew something about breeding, but he wasn't fit to lick my shoe." "You were crazy about him for a while," said Catherine. "Crazy about him?" cried Myrtle incredulously. "Who said I was crazy about him? I never was any more crazy about him than I was that man over there." She pointed suddenly at me, and everyone looked at me accusingly. I tried to show my expression that I played no part in her past. Let's stop there. Have a good evening.